So if all of you online could mute until you're ready to ask a question, that would be great. And that way we won't get too much feedback and that kind of thing. If you don't know how, I can do it for you. So our plan is to just ask you for your comments, your feedback, your questions, your frustrations. I've heard from a number of you, I'm seeing familiar faces. I've heard from a number of you over the years who have some things to say. So I'm confident that there will be some input. So I think we'll just open it up and start there and ask, what do you want to talk about? Things that might not sit well with you about our Christian tradition. We're all completely happy? Okay, so those of you online, I don't know whether you can hear or not because we're working from a pretty small microphone. So Ken said, Jesus died for our sins. Can you say more about what bothers you about that?
I don't believe it. And I think I would be interested in where that came from. Is Paul the first one that came up with that, or were there other apostles that talked about that?
Okay. So Ken says, if you didn't hear, where did that come from? Ken doesn't believe it, but
Was Paul the originator of that thought?
So I don't think Paul. I'm not sure Paul is the one to blame, but actually, I think it's people reading Paul wrong. So the question of Jesus died for our sins, I think, is an interesting. Sometimes that's called substitutionary atonement, and it really comes most forcefully out of the Middle Ages, when there was this feudal society with a lord. The overlap with theological language is substantial. There's a lord to whom you owe everything, who provides you with land and a place to live, and you work for the Lord, and you pay off the use of the land through your labor. So this becomes a big model in the Middle Ages for thinking about theology, that this is what Jesus does for us, is we all owe this unpayable debt of sin, what John Calvin called total depravity. We're all totally depraved, nothing good about us, and so the only good thing about us is that Jesus loves us enough to pay that debt for us. It's actually, you could preach that sermon from today's lectionary text, I think, of unpayable debt. And if the Father doesn't come through, then that guy's just lost, right? So that, though, it does depend on a reading of Paul. You're right. And it's a reading that really crystallizes around Martin Luther. So Martin Luther, I think, is just an interesting figure. He's an Augustinian monk in the late 1400s, early 1500s, and he has, today I think this is not a joke, but I think today we would diagnose him with something. We would say he has some sort of, personality compulsion where he feels all the time inadequate. He doesn't have what he needs. He feels this way especially about God, that God could never love him. He could never do enough. And so the story about Martin Luther is he would go to confession, he would go to confess his sins, and just do that for hours on end. He would never get to the end, and he would be confessing things that, most of us don't think about, but he thinks they're this grave sin between him and God. And so much that his confessor at one point kicked him out and said, don't come back until you've got something to confess, because we're all wasting our time here. And so he then transfers this to his critique of Roman Catholicism. And he says, well, the church hasn't done a good job of managing sin and guilt. And so in the Roman Catholic system, kind of famously, there were ways to kind of get rid of your sin. You could pay an indulgence, which Luther really didn't like. You could make a pilgrimage, you could give alms, you could do all sorts of things, say a prayer. And so Luther thought, well, that's not working. Works isn't going to cut it. So he rereads Paul, he rereads Romans especially, and in there he finds kind of a blueprint. Here's how I can be justified before God. Now he does that only by misreading Paul, I would argue. By reading Paul as an individualistic, me and God kind of thing, where Paul, I don't think, is thinking about that at all. But it's possible to kind of take the words out of Romans and come up with that reading. And so that's where it comes from. And as Protestants, we kind of inherit that. So this problem isn't as strong in other traditions. If some of you have been Roman Catholic, there's plenty of guilt and shame to go around, but it's not the same kind of Jesus died for me, therefore I am in abject, you know, position of inferiority before Jesus. So I agree. I don't like that either. And it's what's called a low anthropology, which just means a very low view of human nature, a low view of human being. Sometimes it's counterbalanced by people who talk about original blessing. That that reading that comes through like John Calvin and others, it comes through Augustine, who talked about original sin. And certainly the world is a broken place, but we can also talk about original blessing, that we come with a part of God reflected in us. And I think that's, for my money, a better way to think about anthropology, what human beings are. So if you're on Zoom, you feel free to type in questions, or you can kind of do the little raise your hand reaction and we can call on you. So I don't want to ignore all of you. You're also attentive there. Other questions or thoughts or things that irritate you? Deb, and then we'll move around the room.
Okay, I'm sure it's different. So,
I'll repeat these for the people on Zoom.
good. I believe there are angels walking on earth, but I have I cannot get my head around some Christians that feel like evil and the devil, the literal embodiment. I don't know. Just give me your thoughts on what that's all about.
Okay.
I've never been into that.
So for the folks on Zoom, the question or the comment is about supernatural beings. So angels and devils and demons, and what's up with that? Do we think that they're real? Do they walk around messing with us?
Yeah.
I read a book when I was like 16. Maybe you read this book, called This Present Darkness. It was a big evangelical book at the time. And the premise of it is they are literally all around us. We just can't see them, like ghosts. And they're just messing with us all the time, trying to get us to do bad things. So I think this goes back, because I study the New Testament, everything goes back to the first century. But it goes back to the first century where Judaism was wrestling with the influence from the East, especially of the legacy of the Babylonian exile, encountering a lot of other cultures and religions, and the encounter from the West of Alexander the Great and the Macedonian and the Greeks. And so Judaism is at that point kind of folding in a lot of new ideas. And one of those new ideas is this belief in supernatural beings. And Judaism had always sort of had this notion that there were other beings besides God. And you can find this all through the Hebrew Bible. And you can even find Satan in the Hebrew Bible in two places only. You can find Satan in the book of Job, and you can find Satan in Daniel, which is a very late book. So what Satan is, though, in the Hebrew Bible is not like the anti-God, as Satan is in the New Testament in some ways. But Satan works for God. Satan is sort of God's prosecuting attorney who finds things that need attention and brings them to God's attention. And that's the premise of the book of Job, basically. Look, here's my servant Job. Look how righteous he is. Let's see. And they go from there. And that's kind of how these beings work in the Hebrew Bible, is that they are subordinate to God, but not opposite of God. As the first century comes along and Judaism is wrestling with these other cultures, suddenly you get this explosion in Judaism, which Christianity is a part of thinking about these as sort of dualistic, that there's the good and the bad. And here's where the evil, Satan is evil, the devil is evil, the anti-God, at cross purposes with God. And that, I think Christianity just happened to flourish at the moment when that happens. The same is true for hell. This notion that there's sort of a cosmic battle going on all the time between good and evil, God and the devil. So that really comes from that, and we inherit it. Now, it really gets its legs, though, in the Middle Ages again, with Dante. So Dante writes the Inferno, and suddenly the devil has a personality, and you can sort of, and hell has a geography, and you can start to think about it in these very realistic terms. So, and by the way, we should just talk about angels. You mentioned angels.
Yeah.
I think I preached on this 12 years ago, before some of you were here. It never fails to amuse me at Christmas. We have a little Christmas pageant, and all the blondest little girls get to be the angels. And this is not biblical, even a little bit. The angels in the Bible are scary. For one thing, they're usually always men.
Which is scary just by saying.
Yeah. Just a man showing up to tell you things. That's a good article, actually. Like reading the Annunciation as a mansplaining narrative. Write that down. Sophie is a seminary student. But they're also, like, if you go back and read like Ezekiel and pay attention to like the cherubim and the seraphim, they're very scary. They have like all these eyes and four faces, and they're supposed to be terrifying. They're the sort of guardians of God's seat. So that morphs somehow into these little kids, with the little halo and the wings. But that's a long way from the biblical tradition of angels. So I think all of that gets kind of squeezed through these experiences of mixing with other cultures over the years. Yeah. I don't see any questions yet online. Jerry had one.
Yeah, Larry has one.
We'll go Jerry, then Larry, then online. How about that?
The basic foundations of our belief, the virgin birth and the resurrection. Growing up a Southern Baptist, of course, there's a question that.
Which part?
You're probably in safe company.
Virgin birth and the resurrection.
Okay.
Tell me.
So Jerry says, we have these, your words, basic foundations of our beliefs, the virgin birth and the resurrection, and that many of us, I think, from lots of traditions, were raised not to question these, and maybe now we do. Is that a good synopsis? Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. So.
Next question.
So I think it's interesting. Again, I always go back to the New Testament. The earliest gospel is the Gospel of Mark, and has neither a virgin birth nor a resurrection. And it's only as the tradition develops that accrues to the tradition. So Matthew and Luke both have kind of elaborate birth stories and elaborate resurrection stories, and then John gets all cosmic with it with the prologue. In the beginning was the Word. But Mark doesn't have anything. Jesus shows up in Mark as a grown-up, and the ending of Mark in 16:8, it ends in the middle of a sentence in Greek. It says, the women who were at the tomb and found it empty ran away in terror and fear, for they were afraid. They were afraid for in Greek. And it feels like it just dropped. So you don't know why they're afraid. There's, if you read the other gospels, you might fill in the blanks. So I think both of these things are if you would ask a gospel writer 2,000 years ago what's important, I think they would have not put this in the top 10 list of like important things. It's not where they spent most of their ink. It's not where they spent most of their time, but they have become important as sort of litmus tests for us. And partly I wonder sometimes if this is because of our unique context in the Americas. So we come through this experience of the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s or something, in Dayton, Tennessee, where suddenly science and religion are supposed to be incompatible, and it's sort of this great battle to stamp out science, or to stamp out religion. No, stamp out science. My colleague Tony Alumko at the Iowa School of Theology has a book called Paranoid Science, where he kind of traces some of this. It's a pretty good book. But essentially what happens, I think, is Christians begin to be asked to believe kind of unbelievable things, and if you can pull that off, then you're a good Christian. And I'm not sure that's what the gospel writers meant to do. The fact that there are 4 gospels and they don't agree with each other suggests a certain level of comfort with ambiguity that we don't possess that much anymore, I don't think. The virgin birth in particular, it comes down to a translation choice that in the book of, is it Isaiah? Somebody, yeah, Isaiah, thank you, Reverend Thompson. The book of Isaiah has this word that means young woman or virgin. You can understand why those might be overlapping terms. And then it comes time to translate it into Greek, and they choose the word parthenos, like the Parthenon in Greece. And that word just means virgin. And so it had a bigger range, and suddenly it gets narrowed. Suddenly Mary is a virgin. it doesn't make a ton of sense, like within the narrative, for her to be a virgin, especially not a perpetual virgin, which is what the church has often claimed over the years. That not only was she when Jesus was born, but also remained so. And there were these sort of cartwheel-like explanations for how she could have children and still remain a virgin. So, that one I think comes down to like a misunderstanding in translation that we just sort of stuck with. Like sometimes my kids will call me on something and I can't lose face, so I just stick with my position because I'm 44 and they're 12, so I get to just like, no, what I said is right, And in some ways, I think that's what the church has done, is it just said, no, she was a virgin. And how, it's not verifiable or unverifiable. You can't go and check. So the other end of things, the other bookend to the missing bookend of the Gospel of Mark is the resurrection. And that one, this is an old story, I think, in ancient Near Eastern religions. In scholarship, it's called the dying and rising God. Lots of gods do this. They die and they rise again. And this is a very old tale. And the degree to which people thought it was literally true, I think, varies over time. So for me, where I've landed on this is, Jesus is a good example of a dying and rising story, dying and rising God. And I don't, this is heretical, whatever. I don't believe in a bodily resurrection. I really don't. But I very much proclaim the resurrection. I think it's a wonderful way to describe the world we live in, that things die and they can be born again, and that life can come out of that. So for me, it functions really, really well. And this is probably where I'm most Christian, that I think resurrection is at the heart of everything, but I don't really care about Jesus's body. I don't think it matters to me that much. I know that it matters to a lot of people, but it doesn't matter to me that much. The thing behind it is what matters to me. So I too grew up in sort of a Baptist context and heard that I should believe these things, and it was hard to let go of them, but once I did, I don't miss them that much, I don't think. I don't know if that's getting at what you... Larry had a question a minute ago.
So the first question had to do with Jesus dying for our sins. But I'd like to start way before Jesus, right?
All right.
Because the original sin was Eve. And that was the cause of mankind, notice mankind, downfall. Was her fault. Otherwise, we'd all be in the Garden of Eden now and we wouldn't have any sin. So
We wouldn't be, because they didn't have sex there. They would still be there.
So anyway, that is one of the things that bothers me about Christianity.
Okay, so Larry, if you didn't hear all that, sorry, I know that you're missing out on stuff. Larry said, the Garden of Eden and this notion of original sin and fallenness, and sort of the way that we, the origins of humanity are described in that kind of fallen way. And blaming Eve, yes, clearly we.
Right, we blame women. Right.
So I think I haven't told this joke in a while. And I'm from the South, and sometimes in the South we say original sin is one you haven't tried yet. You got to add it to your list. So, yeah, this goes back to Augustine, actually, who is a 4th, 5th century North African, very influential North African theologian. And Augustine, like Martin Luther, had a lot of hang-ups, and not a little bit of misogyny, actually. He had some problems. But he's brilliant and very prolific, so we pay a lot of attention to him. And his sort of mortal enemy in theology, what's this guy's name? I just had it. I'll think of it in a minute. Anyways, this British monk guy who thought that we were essentially good. Basically, that position I gave earlier about like original blessing. It's right on the tip of my tongue. What is that? What's that? No. Pelagius, thank you. See? so good to go to an intellectual church.
Christianity.
Did you?
Yes.
Well, so Pelagianism is as much an invention of Augustine as it is of Pelagius. It's not, we don't really have anything from Pelagius. We don't really know what he said, but all we have is Augustine being mad at Pelagius. And what he was mad about was Augustine did not think it's true that that we were good and then bad things happen. Augustine thinks we're just bad. And his example for this, by the way, is babies are selfish. He's like, babies, when they're hungry, they cry. That shows that before we even know anything about the world, we're just in it for ourselves. We're thinking about ourselves all the time. It's true. Babies are like that. I'm not sure it's a flaw in the human nature, but I think it's because they want to eat. So it develops over time, I think, as a way to sort of ground a theology in which we are paying back debt, sort of going back to that first question of, how do we get right? Well, the fundamental problem with getting right with God is we've never been right with God, so we can't work our way out of it. And Augustine's thought became so influential, I think that's just sort of stuck. The feminism piece of that piece where Eve is the one who gets the blame for it is really interesting and also tragic, of course. There's, a tradition in Judaism called midrash, which is where you, use what Will de Gaffney has called sanctified imagination, sort of read between the lines, and tell the parts of the story that are missing. And so there are any number of really interesting midrashim about Eve and Adam, and thinking about the ways that the blame shifts to Eve there. So I don't know, maybe it'd be fun to read one of those in Progressive Christianity or something. Yeah, but I think it's not surprising that that's how it turns out, right? That she gets the blame. It's also interesting, since you asked about Adam and Eve, we were talking about this with the youth group the other night, that there are two creation stories in the same way there's four gospels. There's sort of conflicting creation stories. And in, I think it's the Genesis 2 one, I'm pointing at you because you were part of that skit that we did. We could do a skit on it. The skit was on, I think, Genesis 2, and it's the account, whichever one the account is, where God says, you know what, Adam is lonely. We need to find a companion. And so God makes all the animals. And that to me is sort of, I don't know, funny that God's like, well, let's try a wildebeest and see if that works, and it doesn't work. Let's try the mosquito. And, God, literally everything that exists, according to this part of Genesis, is an attempt to make something that will make Adam happy, and where we end up is the woman. So, there's some baked in misogyny there, I think, of woman as afterthought and woman as scapegoat and woman as theological dumping ground that I don't think we have to hold on to. And a lot of those midrashim are ways to kind of redeem Eve's role in that. One of them is that there was a companion for Adam before Eve named Lilith, Lilith, who was not compliant enough, and so got banished. And along comes Eve, because she would be more compliant. Hence the Lilith Fair in the 90s, any 90s people? There was a women's music festival called the Lilith Fair. So anyway, I'm rambling now. Other questions, online folks? Type them in the chat or raise your hand, or, okay, Dick. Can you unmute? You're still muted. Let's see.
Okay, I have really two questions. One of them that has bothered me for years, and I think last week or last time we were talking about the Pauline influence, and that is the whole business of conversion and conversion experience. I have been a part of three major denominations: Methodist, Presbyterian, and then finally UCC. And in the Presbyterians, I also, it's a small church, got tapped to be a deacon and went through the quote ordination kind of thing, or whatever it is that makes me a deacon in there. And I was really guilty for not having had a conversion experience that really says you've done this, you've crossed over. Then secondly, my second questions that bothers me, and it's kind of hard to believe, is as many of you know, I'm a sociologist, but I have a background in biology and very much interested in evolutionary stories. And that brings me to the point of the creation stories. Now, you mentioned that there are at least two, but then if you look at the broad sequence of events that we have in science about whatever happened in the universe, it's an explosion, and then we go through all of these stages. And in a sense, it parallels what happens, or you vaguely parallels what you see in the biblical terms. Do you understand what I'm saying? My question is, which came first?
So I hear two questions in there. One is about conversion, and that sort of experience that's expected almost of having an epiphany and a feeling that you've discovered something that you hadn't known before. And then the other is a question about science and Genesis. So that first question about conversion, here it goes back to Paul again. You're right. So 3 times in the book of Acts, Saul is described as having an experience on the road to Damascus where he has this, maybe a vision, maybe an apparition or something. It's a little vague, where he becomes convinced that his life earlier had been wrong and he's going to do something different. It's out of fashion to call this a conversion. Now people point out that the structure of it is more like a prophetic call narrative, the same way that the prophets get called. The same thing happens to Saul, who then becomes Paul. But it has kind of served as like the paradigmatic, like this is what it means to be a Christian, is you've got to have this moment of reversal where you're going in one direction and suddenly you're going to go in a different direction, and you're going to, it's very emotionalized. You've got to have like a deeply felt experience. And I think this, so it's an old idea, Paul has it, but I think it becomes especially prominent in the 20th century as evangelicalism in North America increases, that this becomes, the thing that you do. If you think about it, if you're in some village in, say, Africa or in Europe somewhere, chances are you grow up, going to the church where your parents went, and there's never a moment when you're not in that community, and so there's no need for a dramatic conversion. But in the evangelical context in America, you have there's sort of a break with old tradition, and so you have to then have that realization that the thing I come from isn't worthwhile, and I need to go do this new thing. So I think it's a relatively recent thing, this sort of cultural weight of conversion as an important thing. It also happens. It's also rooted in Christianity's polemics against Jews in the ancient world. Sophia and I have been in a class that just ended a week ago on Jewish-Christian relations in antiquity. And Jews were all the time subjected to kind of forced conversions on the model of Paul, and still have been, of course, for a long time since. Going on still, yeah. Either forced, culturally, or forced, at knife point or something. The other question about science, I think, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And for me, it's a question of genre. So it's always important, I think, to read biblical texts like Genesis with an eye to what they meant to be doing. And a book like Genesis did not mean to be a science book. It never intended to do that. We've turned it into one, but that's not what it was for. It's it's a book that comes out of the Iron Age. And it comes out of this tribal context where people are trying to make sense of who we are, why we're here, who we are as a people, who we are as people. And we try to force it into a science book. So I agree with you, Dick. I think there are ways to read it that sound like what modern science might tell us about the world. I think that's coincidence. And I don't think we should dwell on that too long, because that's asking Genesis to do something that it never needed to do. It's a story for a people. It's kind of a peopling story. It's a story that makes a people. And to turn it into a scientific account, I think, sidesteps what it's trying to do. Not that I appreciate those accounts. I think it's neat to think about, hey, these people sitting in a desert 2 or 3,000 years ago understood something about the world, that we're just now understanding better. That's great. But I think Genesis, we should allow it to be a story as much as we can.
In the Hebrew, isn't it kind of read like a poem? Genesis?
So Sophia is saying in the Hebrew, isn't it read like a poem? And there are parts of it that are, yeah. Parts of it that are epic, like ancient Near Eastern epic. It takes on like the Epic of Gilgamesh. There are parts that mirror that kind of thing. And Joan is nodding because Joan knows all about this stuff.
So you Irish professors are really good at taking these myths and strip them away from young impressionable. So you take away our Genesis story about Eve and all that stuff, and you replace it with what? Because we now know that the universe is 14 billion years old, and the Almighty Creator allowed billions of years of our ancestors to suffer random cruelty in the life of the animals. So, what are you going to replace Genesis with? Why are we cruel and selfish? Why are we dishonest? Where does that come from?
So
Loving stuff.
So for those online, Phil.
If there's no Eve, what happened?
Phil asked a small question about. So he's saying, if we strip away all these myths, strip away all these stories, and say they're not really real, they didn't happen. What do we hang our hats on? I think is kind of what you're asking. Like,
How do we explain the world?
how do we explain the world? Why are we here? Right?
You got 5 minutes.
Or less.
I think Genesis and the rest of the Bible, for that matter, can still do what it's always done, which is tell us about ourselves. It's a mirror where we can see ourselves. So to me, reading, all you have to do is read the first 10 or 12 chapters of Genesis, and I think you can understand 90% of being a human being. That you have this Cain and Abel, right? Like we encounter the other and we feel violence, and we feel jealousy, and we act ways that we later wish we hadn't acted. That seems true to me. It's true. Like, I don't know if it ever happened, but it's pretty true. The story of the Tower of Babel, that's what we do. We try to know more than we know. And the beginnings of Genesis, where it's all grounded in mystery. I haven't found a better story yet. I don't believe it happened that way, but it's the best story I have for kind of explaining how it happened. So it's paradoxical. What you're asking for is kind of a constructive theology, I think, of now what? Like, if knowing all these things that we know, now what? How do we live? And to me, Bible as story is still the best way to structure my life. And it's, for the communities I value, it's the way we structure them, even as we are critical of them. So I still see value in it. I still see it as being the thing that can tell me what it means to be a human being. And it doesn't have to be scientific. The myths don't have to be, a factual account in the New York Times for me to think they're useful. Resurrection works that way. Virgin birth works that way. I still stand up on Christmas Eve and read that story because it means something. Does that? So
there was no fall. It's always been this.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
And is justice a thing?
So Phil asked a follow-up short question. Is justice a thing? If there's no fall that we can point to and say this is where it all went sideways, how do we know what justice looks like? How do we know? And actually, I asked this question of my colleague, Miguel de la Torre, once, because he wrote this book about hopelessness, which I've preached on here before, and I find really valuable. But his point is, having hope is a privilege. And so my response was, well, how do you know what justice looks like if you don't have a hope in something that isn't here yet? That, to me, that's what justice is like, this is slightly better than the thing we had before. So the fancy theological word for this is teleology. Like, where's this all going? And where has it been in some ways? And I think where we've been, taking that 14 billion year timeline, we've been, single-celled organisms. We've been, coming down out of trees onto the savanna. We've been lots of places. And in every case, we've had to kind of fight. Like, it's, which poet was it? Matthew Arnold, maybe? Somebody who said, nature is red in tooth and claw. That's how it is. And what I think these stories can do for us is show us a vision of something that isn't here yet, which is maybe we don't have to be that way. Maybe there's enough for us to be a different way. Maybe there's a kind of justice, to use the word you used, that can inform our lives, where we don't just have to kill and eat each other all the time. Because that is our story. That's how we got here. Our ancestors were better at it than other people's ancestors. So here we are. And maybe there's another way. So that's its own kind of vision of the future. It's a horizon we haven't reached and probably won't in our lifetimes, but I like trying. Not as satisfying. Joan has a question. Go ahead, Joan.
You might expect this question from me. The concept of the Trinity. There are Reformation theologians who maintain that concept does not appear in the Bible, although I might argue that Jesus' baptism might be a situation where something like that comes up. But tell me about that. Tell me about it.
I find a little bit of delight in the Unitarian trying to convince us that the Trinity appears in the New Testament.
Well, maybe I'm not a committed Unitarian. Maybe I'm
by the way, I have coffee tomorrow with your youth director at the UU church. So.
Oh, great. That's great.
Yeah, the Trinity, I am actually one of those who thinks that it does not appear in the New Testament. There are places where you can see it, like the baptism, like Matthew 20 something, the Great Commission. There are places where you can see it, but those places are all textually a little suspicious, that they either they've been messed with or they're just not that clear. They're not as clear as we would hope. So I think, certainly there are long traditions of the Spirit, right, being an important aspect of God. You see that all the way through the biblical tradition, that breath or wind or spirit or wisdom appears throughout as a way to describe God and God's actions. And, this notion of God's Son it's not new to Christianity either. There are people who are called the sons of God throughout not only Judaism, but also other traditions. As I talked earlier about the dying and rising God, there are other aspects of that same set of traditions that talk about, and you know this, of course, that talk about, the son of a God overthrowing that God and taking the throne. This is a very common motif in lots of Mediterranean mythologies. So I think all the pieces are there, right? It's not surprising that Christianity came up with a Trinity, but it didn't come up with it until a few hundred years later. And we can read it back into the tradition. We can read it in the Gospels. We can read it in Paul if we really want to. But I think, sometimes that's special pleading in a way, that we're trying to see something that if you had sat down and asked, the author of Matthew, do you think there's a Trinity? They would have been a little scandalized by it. But in hindsight, the tradition could see that the pieces were there. So for me, one of the sticking points for me in any community like this one is, as you can tell from this conversation, we all have very varying viewpoints. We all accept some things, reject other things. And when it comes to joining the church, standing up and affirming we want to be part of this church, or when it comes to confirmation, or when it comes to baptism, we revert back to somewhat traditional categories. Even though, 90% of the people in the pews don't, well, maybe 90 is high, I don't know. Some number of people in the pews don't think that there's a Trinity, or don't care, or virgin birth, whatever. The thing we ask people to recite and affirm still has all those things in it. And to me, that's really interesting and frustrating, but also getting back to what Phil was talking about, to me, it's sort of a horizon we can look toward, that we can affirm things we don't understand and don't believe, and that we can do them together. Nadia Bowles-Weber, who's a Denver area theologian and pastor, has said, the thing she loves about church is when it comes time to say a creed, you don't believe everything in the creed, but someone in the room believes every part of it. Someone's there to affirm the thing you cannot affirm. And I think that's what church is about. So for me, the Trinity is it's not a functional category. It doesn't matter to me. I'm saying a lot of things don't matter, but I still like to affirm it. I still think, yes, God shows up in a lot of different ways, probably more than 3, and we should pay attention to that.
Well, I agree with you in that regard, because Jenny often finishes her sermon saying, excuse me, Spirit will lead the way.
Yeah.
Spirit will lead the way. I like that. Now, does she mean the Holy Spirit, or?
Well, and the Spirit's been leading the way, longer than any of us have been alive. It's been doing its thing, and I have every confidence it'll continue to, the Holy One or not. Elizabeth Thompson has a comment.
Well, it's actually tied to the Trinity, but also to Phil's question. And it's not so much one of the things that I actually love about the Trinity is that it talks about community and relationship.
Yeah.
And so, as opposed to that, tribalism, or we killed you before the others, therefore we survived, that kind of sense. Part of what the Trinity says is, no, we exist together.
Mm-hmm.
There's a connection that is there, even if we can't identify it. There's a way of the perichoresis. We're in with each other, where we dance together. There's a weaving that happens. And to me, that's part of what is important about the Trinity, which is maybe less so than is it God the Father, Jesus the Son, the kind of traditional language, but that is an example of how we live community.
Yeah.
And if it's divine, then there is a blessing that's the direction we're going.
So for those online, Elizabeth was making a very eloquent point that I will not be able to recreate, that essentially is saying, it's a model for relationality. It's a way of showing that even for God is in relationship with God's self, that the whole thing is sort of structured around being in relationship. And I think that's right. Interestingly, I've started teaching and writing on queer theory recently in the last few years. And if you don't know about queer theory, it's essentially using sexuality and gender to think about the way the world is, and for me, the way the Bible is. And a lot of queer theorists find a lot of value in the Trinity as a model of relationality. It's a way of saying, you're always connected, whether you think you are or you're not. We always show up in different ways in different places, and that God's relationality with God's self is a model for us to think with. So it's a valuable way to talk, as long as we bracket ontology. Ontology is just a question of what's really real. If you just relax about that a minute, there's a lot of really valuable stuff in almost everything we're talking about. It's where we insist, probably because of the inheritance of the Enlightenment and the Scopes monkey trial, when we start to insist that these things are ontologically true and no other truth can exist, that's where I think things start to fall apart a little bit for me. What time does this end? 12:15, but we started a little late, almost at the end, maybe 1 or 2 more. Nancy?
No, I was saying, I'm just gonna tell you it's 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Yeah.
She's got 5 minutes.
Ken?
You made reference earlier to the Son of God. Did the early Christians get that from the culture?
Good question. So Ken asked about the phrase "son of God," and did early Christians get that from the surrounding culture? I think they got it from two places. One is the surrounding culture, and well, two parts of the same surrounding culture. One is Judaism, and one is sort of the Greek influence. So within Judaism, this is a phrase that shows up frequently. Sometimes it's meant to describe some of those supernatural beings, the B'nai Elohim, the sort of sons of God. And other times it's used to describe really important people with close relationships to God, like David. So there are precedents within Judaism for thinking about someone with a close relationship to God as a son of God. Interestingly, I don't recall ever seeing a daughter of God. So that's just a product of the culture. But there are also, lots of influences in the Greek and Roman culture surrounding Christianity as it's emerging that do the same thing. So one of my favorite examples is Julius Caesar, the Ides of March, gets stabbed. I saw a funny thing on the internet, they would say in his obituary, he died surrounded by his friends. That he died surrounded by his friends who stabbed him to death. But his adopted heir, Octavian, who becomes known as Caesar Augustus, declares himself to have been a son of a god, and he puts it on coins. So this is imperial propaganda. It circulates all through the empire that Augustus is a son of a god. Alexander the Great, calls himself a son of a god, and other people call him that because the story was his mother was not a virgin birth, but impregnated by a snake, a god in the form of a snake. So these stories are everywhere. And it's both sort of a long-standing Jewish way to talk about the way divinity works, and it's also the way to get some cultural capital within the Roman Empire is to claim, hey, I've got divine parentage. Hercules is like this. Heroes are like this. There's in Greek and Roman mythology are full of people philandering with gods, and the offspring of those relationships are important people. So yeah, so Jesus is one of those. Of course, we've theologized it differently than that, but that's I think the milieu that it comes out of. Time for maybe one more. Okay, Dick, go ahead.
Well, I was just the heroes and sons. Favorite author of mine is Joseph Campbell and The Power of Myth. And then there's a fuss that I have always had with Christianity, and particularly a kind of evangelical Christianity, that this is the only way, and that everything has came. And then also, well, partly related to Campbell and the Power of Myth, the need, I should say, of a creation story among virtually every culture that we know to explain who we are, why we're here, and where we're going.
Yeah, maybe I'll approach your question in a way that you're not expecting. I don't know. It's the end of the time. I'm running out of steam. So the horsepowers are chugging along here. So I think, yeah, we want the Bible to have explanatory power. We want our traditions to have explanatory power. I'm losing the first part of your question in my mind, but I think,
This is the only way.
yeah, and so I really kind of want to launch into, what is that, John something? I am the way, the truth, and the life,
Right.
which often gets claimed as a statement of exclusivity, like this is the one path, and anyone who deviates from it is wrong. I think that's again a translation artifact. In Greek, there are definite articles like "the" in the Greek, but that's just because that's what those words require in Greek, and I think we are paying too much attention to them. I think Jesus is saying something more like "I am way, I am truth, I am life," and it's harder to get rid of the "no one comes to the Father except by me." But in Paul, there's a long argument about whether Paul thinks Jesus is the only way or not. And I'm one of those who thinks, Paul thinks there's at least two ways of salvation. One, of course, being the covenant that God made with Israel, and the other being Jesus, who lets people into that covenant God made with Israel. So I think the Bible itself is a little conflicted on this and has multiple opinions. If I may wander into theology just for a minute, I have a hard time thinking that God is out there looking for, gotcha clauses. I think God is more embracing and less excluding. So I tend to read Christianity as one of lots of ways to be a human being in relationship with other human beings in the world and with God. And I'm less worried about, which way is the right way. And if we get to the end of it all and it was, some other thing all along, cool. I'm not that invested in us being right, Jerry?
James Ferguson used to say, think of a mountain. God is
Yeah.
on top of the mountain. There are many paths up the mountain. Ours is just one path.
So Jerry's quoting Jane Ann Ferguson, who some of you know, that there's a mountain, and ours is one of the many ways up the mountain, and that seems right. Or we're the elephant. We're one view into the elephant. We can describe one part of the whole, and I think that's right. I don't know. Well, this has been fun. I'm really glad it's over.
Thank you very much.
I'm tired.
Eric.
Thanks for joining online. I'm going to stop the recording. How do I stop the recording? I don't know. You think I would know by the end of the pandemic?